Okay, guys, it's off to the new year, and we've got a fantastic guest amongst us here. Probably the one with the most incredible title, the Right Honorable the Viscount Ridley, member of the House of Lords. Of course, he's also a doctor. He's a holder of a PhD from Oxford University, a zoologist.
E. Phil from Oxford University.
Oh, okay.
They don't use the word PhD for some reason.
There you D-Phil. Thank you for the correction. Author of several books, and as I mentioned to Matt offline, I want to be assiduous in listing all the books because I receive endless emails from people asking me why, which books they should be reading. Well, just start by reading Matt Ridley's books and you should be fine. So here we go. The Red Queen, Sex and the Evolution of Human Nature, one of your earlier books. The Origins of Virtue, Human Instincts and the Evolution of Cooperation. Genome, the Autobiography of a Species in 23 chapters. Nature via Nurture, I love that title. Genes, Experience and What Makes Us. Francis Crick, Discoverer of the Genetic Code. The Rational Optimist, How Prosperity Evolves. And his most recent book, I think from a few years ago, The Evolution of Everything, How Ideas Emerged. Did I miss anything?
Nope, that's the full set. Well, not quite the full set. My very, very first book, which is very hard to find now because almost nobody bought it, is called Warts and All, and it's an account of a presidential election in the United States in 1988, which I covered as a journalist.
Okay. I don't even think, is it listed on Amazon?
It's pretty hard to find. Probably not. I don't know.
I didn't see it, so okay. But before we start, I have a small bone to pick with you. And I think it's important that we address it because you are a member of the House of Lords, so you have political connections. Sure, my title is Professor Dr. Gad Saad, but I feel as though there is something greatly missing. There's a grave injustice. We all agree that it should be Sir Professor Dr. Gad Saad. Canadians can't be knighted. So I'm presuming...
You sure?
I think so. And if not, then it's an even worse injustice. Because when am I invited to be knighted?
Honorary knights, I think. But
so I trust
the Queen and get it sorted.
Thank you. That's exactly. I was just hoping that you'd speak to the Queen, get together, and resolve this problem, and we can finally meet face to face.
Sir Galahad. But anyway, doesn't Gad mean God?
They are one of the same. They are indistinguishable. All right. So what I thought we would do is we'd start with your latest book, The Evolution of Everything. And basically each chapter is, the evolution of fill in the blank, which really, resonates with my heart because I always speak about, consilience. Anything involving biological agents ultimately can't be understood without the illuminating lens of evolutionary theory. So we've got evolutionary architecture and literary Darwinism. So, and this of course fits under the general rubric of universal Darwinism. So is that really your idea in that book?
Yes, I mean, I was just increasingly struck as I grew older by the fact that lots of things that we think of as man-made actually, in a sense, could be seen as evolved too, whether it's physical structures or mental structures or society generally, the economy. All these things changed by a process that is so close to natural selection that it is effectively natural selection. It's experimental trial and error. And we go around making the same creationist mistake about human society, I think, that we used to make about the natural world. In other words, we saw something complex and functioning and with a good fit between form and function, and we said that must mean there's a designer out there, there's an intelligent designer. We gave up on that idea mostly about the natural world, but we haven't given up on it with respect to the man-made world. So we look at a complex economy and we say, well, someone must be in charge. Or we look at society and we say someone's running it. Or we look at education and we say it must be a top-down phenomenon. We have to teach people. It's not a bottom-up learning phenomenon. So I just thought I would try and go through as many aspects of the world as I could and explain them in evolutionary, Darwinian, natural selection terms rather than top-down, heroic, someone's in charge terms, and see how far I could get.
Which of the various forays wherein you sought to apply evolutionary theory did you find it to be most challenging to apply it in, or most surprising? So, for example, in my case, in one of my books, I have a table where I list all of the disciplines that have thus far been somewhat Darwinized. And some of those fields, you wouldn't expect them to have been Darwinized, such as literary Darwinism or evolutionary architecture. So in your case, where did you get that sort of, this was surprising moment?
Yeah, so some were quite easy, like language. It's very obvious that language evolves. It's not there isn't somebody in charge of the English language deciding which words get invented and which words get dropped. And, it's quite clear that it's been invented by all of us gradually through trial and error over millions of years, through survival of one idea and not of another. Likewise, the internet, it's pretty clear, I think, that nobody invented the internet, nobody's in charge of the internet, it's evolving among the way we all operate. But when you take something like government, it was quite a challenge to say government has evolved, because by definition, government is a top-down thing. It's someone in charge, it's a monopoly, and it's kind of invented. Somebody comes along and says, I'm king, or I'm president, or whatever. And yet, if you look at the history of it, it is quite clear that it emerges very gradually as a sort of monopoly on violence by some people in society, who then do a sort of deal with the rest of people in society, saying, look, I'll keep the society as peaceful as I can in exchange for you not having any guns, or whatever it might be. And I want, I could sort of tell a historical story that kind of fits that government gradually then becomes something else by trial and error. It becomes a social welfare machine. It becomes all sorts of things that it is today. But I wanted to tell a story that you could see it happening in real time. And I found a wonderful example in the emergence of governance in prisons, because gangs take over prisons and run them and suppress violence and set up structures that look like miniature bureaucracies. And it happens, when a prison gets big enough and when it's been around long enough. And for example, in women's prisons, this phenomenon hadn't happened until a few years ago. It now has happened, etc. So I felt that was an example of government evolving in a particular society.
If I may interject, I think to add to your example of sort of penal governance, in women's prisons, you also have often the creation of quasi-family units, where there is sort of a mama and sort of a kin mechanism.
That's very interesting. The other one, of course, was the evolution of God, or the evolution of religion, where it's pretty clear to me that God starts out as a really quite nasty and very anthropomorphic bloke who's very jealous and very cross, the sort of Greek gods and the early Jehovah stuff. And by now, in most religions, he's a disembodied spirit of benevolence in some sense of community, if you like. How does that happen? How does that change? Well, it doesn't happen because somebody wakes up and invents a new version of God. It happens because lots of people are trying different versions of God along the way, and some ideas succeed better than others, and there's a gradual evolutionary change.
So that's the sort of trial and error, mutation element, correct?
Yeah, and I think this is the crucial ingredient, that as long as there's a degree of trial and error going on in some phenomenon, then you will get evolution. There's some very nice modeling work by Joe Henrich, which shows that I think it's called The 5 Misunderstandings of Cultural Evolution, his paper. And he says that people say, look, you can't apply evolution to human affairs because humans know where they want to get to. They know what they want to change something to. And he says, yes, but as long as there's a degree of trial and error, then you will get a surprisingly strong evolutionary force. It's very obvious in technology, where technologies meet and mate and have baby technologies, and these gradually change over time. So the first motor car looks like it's been sired by the horse cart and the bicycle, if you see what I mean, and then it gradually turns into something else along the way.
But incidentally, you mentioned Joe Henrich. He's become, I guess, a friend, and he's been on my show. I highly recommend his work to anybody who's watching. A truly fantastic guy, and someone who
one of the smartest thinkers out there, actually.
He is, and he's a wonderful example of sort of the counter argument to people who are detractors of evolutionary psychology, who think that culture, the study of culture, is somehow not within the purview of evolutionary theory. Nothing could be further from the truth. So, for example, behavioral ecologists precisely study cross-cultural differences, right? They study why an adaptive response in niche A is right and a separate adaptive response in niche B is correct. So the classic example I'd love to give of that is Darwinian gastronomy, the idea that different culinary traditions evolve in different niches precisely because of ambient temperature, and ambient temperature correlates with pathogenic density. And therefore, to simply refer to culture as, as the mechanism says nothing. You have to explain ultimately why these different cultural forms have taken. So have you in your work, and I guess one of your books, Nature via Nurture, and so on, you're addressing this. Have you gotten a lot of blowback from people when you try to apply the evolutionary lens to what seems to be something that you shouldn't be applying it to culture?
Oh, yes. It's always difficult. And battles that I thought I had won 25 years ago in The Red Queen about how biological differences between males and females, for example, are similar in our species to other species, and that's because they're homologous, not analogous, that there is a deep evolutionary similarity there, are having to be refought today. And everybody's now saying gender is fluid. Somebody pointed out on Twitter the other day that we're supposed to believe that gender is fluid, but that homosexuality is innate.
That's right. Heterosexuality is imposed, but homosexuality is natural. That makes perfect sense for a sexually reproducing species.
Right. But then, if you take homosexuality, I did in The Red Queen, I think, struggle with the issue of why do homosexuals exist? On the whole, they leave behind fewer children, so it should die out as a trait. I've now come across, actually, for the first time, a really convincing explanation of this in Richard Wrangham's new book, which is just out, I think, very shortly, if it's not already, and it's a book about domestication. And the answer is basically that we are a very self-domesticated species. We've done to ourselves what we did to cats and dogs and other things, which is tame ourselves. And one of the things you do to do that is you have to suppress the tendency to attack strangers. We're very good at premeditated violence. We're very bad at reactive violence as a species. You bump into someone in the street, on the whole, they don't turn around and hit you. That just is impossible in chimpanzee world. They do that all the time. And one of the ways we've suppressed this reactive violence is by preventing the final innervation of part of the brain during development. And this has led to much more sort of sexual fluidity about things like homosexuality, as it tends to do in domesticated other species. Now, that might or might not be the right explanation, but it's a very interesting one. It's an evolutionary one. It's a cultural evolutionary one. And crucially, and Wrangham is a very good example of this in his work, because both with, the invention of dairy farming, the invention of cooking, it's not that a gene changes and that enables us to have a culture. It's the other way around. Right. We change our culture, and that puts genetic selection pressure on
it. That's dual inheritance models, right? That's gene culture coevolution, correct?
Exactly. And so, Simon Fisher and I wrote a paper some years ago arguing that we need, that if we find genes that are related to linguistic skills in human beings, like the FOXP2 gene that he was studying, it shouldn't be thought of as an enabler of language. It should be thought of as a gene that has changed in response to the fact that we use spoken language.
Fair enough. You mentioned very briefly sort of the gender fluidity stuff. So I've been mired in this kind of debate. I went to the Canadian Senate in 2017 to explain to the Canadian senators that there is such a thing as male and female in the human species, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, as you watch this, as someone who, you're a trained zoologist, as you mentioned, you study, comparative psychology or comparative morphology, homology, analogy across species. What's your response to some of the activism that you see, certainly with the gender issue, with the transgenderism? Where do you stand on this issue?
Well, on the one hand, I have to admit that I have been impressed during my lifetime by the degree to which some gender stereotypes turn out not to be very deeply rooted and can easily be got rid of. I think, and if you took my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation and you said, look, women are just as good at being prime minister. Well, in the case of Britain, they're very good at being prime minister. We're head of state. We've got a queen and a female prime minister. That would have been extraordinary to people 2 generations ago who thought women weren't capable of that. Clearly, that's nonsense, and clearly we have to get used to the idea that, and I'm very glad to do so, that we mustn't underestimate women in certain roles, and we mustn't underestimate men in certain other roles where we thought they weren't suited. And I'm all for understanding the fluidity of that. But then, drill down a bit and say, what are the most dangerous professions? Logging, fishing, farming, or whatever. How male-dominated are these professions?
But that's because it's the patriarchy that's stopping noble women from engaging in those activities.
You really?
No, I'm being sarcastic.
I know you are.
Yeah.
But isn't it possible that a greater degree of risk-taking in males leads them to be more likely to go into those kind of professions? Do we really think that there is that women are longing to become lumberjacks? It's just sexism that's preventing them doing that. Probably not. Let's get used to the fact that men and women have mental differences as well as physical ones. And yes, let's admit there's a spectrum. Of course, there are women who want to be more like men, to the point sometimes of changing their gender. And yes, there are a few men who want to do the opposite. But on the whole, there's relatively small numbers who want to do both. And it is perfectly sensible to generalize about men and women.
But can I still teach my courses as though there is such a thing as male or female, or should I include 873 genders in my courses?
I think I don't think you should. I'm sure you don't. I think this business of trying to sort of categorize everybody, just as the obsession with categorizing people by race that's come back. I thought we tried to get rid of that. I thought we didn't care what color people's skins were. Let's talk about them as human beings instead of doing this apartheid thing of saying, are you Asian? Are you African origin? Likewise, in the case of gender, let's admit that there is lots of different ways of being male and lots of different ways of being female, and there are ways of being neither one nor the other. But on the whole, there are some very big generalizations, that there are people who both have the male bodies and have male chromosomes and have male leaning personalities, and vice versa for females. To force down the throats of a whole generation of students the idea that there is nothing biological at all about gender seems to me extremist and fundamentalist in a rather scary way.
See, I think so. In my forthcoming book, I talk about where these I call them idea pathogens, or really parasites of the human mind, and cultural relativism, identity politics, postmodernism, radical feminism. And I try to explain, so the ecosystem where they've evolved in, or what, patient zero, if you'd like, is in the university. But why? Right. Where did these ideas come from? How come? And I think I might have found a sort of general explanation across all of these, and maybe you'll tell me if I'm on the right track. So I think that many of these ideas really all come from a noble place, right? So, for example, the blank slate premise is really a message of hope. It says that we are all born with equal potentiality, and if only the right environments were present, we could all be the next Einstein. We could all be the next Michael Jordan or Lionel Messi. Well, that's a hopeful message. It's a perfectly delusional and idiotic one, but it's hopeful. If we can get rid of biology so that I could self-identify as male on Monday, female as Tuesday, boy, that's liberating. I'm not shackled by the oppression of reality.
Right.
Cultural relativism, same idea, and so on. So I think, could it be that really all of these ideas stem from a desire to create a worldview that simply is more hopeful, and in the service of that goal, I then head down a trajectory of lunacy because I'd like to support that noble objective. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it almost certainly does. And the idea that one can be driven mad in pursuit of very noble goals is actually a very important one. And it's important not to not to attack the motivations of people who are pursuing this kind of thing. But for me, this comes back to the question of the meritocracy. You know, what does it mean to say that someone has achieved their potential in society and not been held back by the prejudices of society? And it's the blank slate nurture philosophy that's really dangerous because it's so fundamentalist. It says that you are the victim of what has happened to you.
Right.
And if by chance you have been deprived of a good school and you've been sent to a bad school and a bad university, then by the time you're 21 years old or whatever, if you believe in nurture, there's nothing there. You are a second-rate person.
Right.
Well, that's a terribly damning philosophy. I like the idea instead that there are out there people in poor families without access to books, without access to good schools, who are nonetheless very clever. And if we can find them and get them good educations, then they will become extraordinarily brilliant scientists and engineers and businessmen and actors and whatever. In other words, that there is such a thing as natural talent. If you believe at all that it's worth trying a bit harder to get people from poor backgrounds into good universities, which I do, and which most people seem to do, believe, then you believe in nature.
Right.
Because there must be something innate that you're trying to appeal to and find.
And of course, I mean, as certainly you know this, but maybe some of our viewers don't know, the nature versus nurture dichotomy is truly an incredibly false one. I mean, evolutionary psychologists speak about the interactionist viewpoint, the idea that we are really in an inextricable melange of both factors. Have you seen a movement toward a greater understanding of the point that I just made, or are most people still rigid sort of dichotomania folks? It's either nature or nurture. What's your sense about that particular debate? Where are we in it?
Well, I wrote a whole book about that, as you know. It's called Nature via Nurture. It was, I think, one of my most successful books in terms of reviewer reaction. It got overwhelmingly good reviews. It was my least successful book in terms of sales. She was terribly interested. Whether the title was putting up, in fact, most people misread the title. They thought I'd written a book called Nature versus Nurture. They just didn't see the via. You know,
Right.
our minds were so processed
Right.
to see one thing that we don't always see what's in front of us. And in that, I made the argument that a lot of our nature is set up to receive nurture. A lot of our nurture is designed to reinforce nature. It's impossible to tease them apart and say one is acting in one direction and one is acting in another. And the more nature a species has, the more nurture it tends to have. I mean, we are, we've got more instincts as well as more learning. It's not a zero-sum game,
Sure.
etc. I made all these arguments, etc., etc. Have I seen the world change its mind on that? No. But is it a little better these days? I mean, do we, on the whole, in psychology, admit that there's a bit of both? Have we absorbed the lesson that personality and intelligence and things have a contribution from innateness as well as from what we educate people with? Yes, I think on the whole there's a little bit of improvement there.
I mean, I think I've now been a professor. This is my 25th year, and as you I think know, I spent much of my career trying to Darwinize the business school hallways, if you'd like, specifically consumer behavior, psychology of decision making, and I've often said that my favorite quote of all time, and that's saying a lot, is one by JBS Haldane, who was not only a brilliant scientist but also a very quotable fellow. And I don't remember the exact quote, so I'll paraphrase it. He basically talks about the 4 stages that scientists go through before they accept what they consider to be a radical idea. Do you know this quote? Do you know what
I think I know, but go ahead.
Yeah. So, stage 1, this is pure bullshit. This is nonsense. This is heresy. as evidence comes in, stage 2, well, this is largely true, but rather perverse point of view. Stage 3, well, this is true, but who cares? It's unimportant. And then stage 4, I always said so. Now, when I always use this quote because I joke that if I were to write an autobiography of my life, if it were worth to be written, I would just need to use this quote as the whole book, because my whole career has been nothing but traversing these 4 stages. And I have the benefit of actually being a email hoarder, whereby I don't get rid of emails. So I have emails from colleagues that were at stage 1 15, 18 years ago, who thought that what I was doing is absolute nonsense with my biology bullshit. Right. But then 15 years later, they're inviting me to give some plenary talk at their society, and therefore they've moved to stage 4. So right. I do think, to take the topic from one of your other books, The Rational Optimist, I think there is a sense of optimism that science and thinking in general is autocorrective. You might have to be patient, but it will eventually autocorrect. Can we say that at least?
Yes, I think that's right. And I think in this question it has. If you go back and read what people were saying in the 1960s about the nature-nurture debate, it really doesn't bear any relation to what people say today. And I don't know how much damage the identity politics obsession is going to do to that, whether it'll really result in people rolling back to a pure nurture view of the world. In a funny way, I don't think it quite fits onto that debate. By the way, there's another aspect of the nature-nurture argument that I find particularly interesting, and I find it useful for dealing with other dichotomized or polarized debates in science. And that is that when I was writing a book about this subject, I went into the history of it quite a lot. I went into behaviorism, Skinner and Watson, the arguments in anthropology, going back to Bose and people like that. And people who are saying, look, it's all nurture or it's all nature. And how they argued and they raged, the sociobiology debate, et cetera, And what I suddenly realized was that what keeps these arguments polarized year in, year out is that people don't read their enemies' arguments. They read their friends' accounts of their enemies' arguments. They read the caricatures of their enemies' arguments. So they're constantly attacking straw men.
Wow. Very good point. So in a sense, it's a form of echo chamber. I mean, not quite, but yeah, okay. So basically, do the legwork.
This is a phenomenon we're all too acutely familiar with now in social media in a much more immediate form.
I want to go back. So I was hoping to do exactly this, which is probably the first half hour of our chat, do mainly the science evolution stuff. And then the second half, we'll get into more sort of political issues. Last question in the first half of our chat. You mentioned earlier God, and so I thought I'd come back and circle back to the idea of the evolution of morality. So this is one of those really irksome topics because what I consider otherwise very sophisticated thinkers can succumb to the following sort of bias, where they exactly believe that morality, evolution explains, why we've evolved opposable thumbs. It explains, why our pancreas are the way they are. But don't you dare explain our minds through evolutionary psychology or certainly morality. There is something divine, unique about morality. Can you squash that idiocy for me, please?
Yes, and I have two ways of answering that argument. One is to talk about how there is no reason to think that the nice aspects of human behavior are any less instinctive or ancient than the nasty aspects. We tend to say he's behaving like an animal when he's behaving badly, but he's behaving like an angel when he's behaving well. And we're implying there that goodness and morality is a recent overlay. And while, of course, we come back to how morality does improve over time, but that's a different phenomenon. Nonetheless, I think it's fairly clear that enlightened self-interest leads human beings to be quite often quite caring. After all, we're nice to our kids. we're doing that for, as we know, genetic reasons. We're not doing it because I mean, some people say, oh, you're doing it so they'll be nice to you in old age. Oh, come on. That's not why you're nice to your kids. You're nice to your kids because you love them. Why do you love them? Because people who loved them had more kids. And people who didn't love them didn't have so many kids survive in any way. So there are clearly evolved instincts to be kind and caring in human society. And one of the interesting features of human beings is that we are quite often kind and caring to strangers. And we do so through mechanisms like commerce. I'll do you a favor by buying something from you, and you'll do me a favor by selling me something. We're both doing each other a favor if we indulge in that. And I think that is an incredibly important cultural evolution that's happened in our society, is that we've worked out how to treat strangers as honorary friends by doing deals with them which are plus. I mean, which both sides benefit. So that has led us down a route of being surprisingly moral towards other human beings. It was Montesquieu who came up with the phrase "du commerce," sweet commerce. That there is something just nice about people when they're dealing with each other on a commercial basis. They can't afford to. It doesn't help if you stab the baker in the back with a knife when you're trying to buy his bread. It means he's not there to sell you bread tomorrow.
Right.
At simple a level as that. But then there's the other argument, which is that morality itself has shown a tendency to change over time. And Steven Pinker explores this beautifully, of course, in his Better Angels of Our Nature. And what he's arguing there is that, and for me, this really goes back to Adam Smith in his book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he says, look, the reason you and I are nice to each other is not because some priest has told us to be nice to each other, but because in growing up in Western society, we have worked out that actually nasty behavior results in bad outcomes and nice behavior results in good outcomes. It wasn't the same in medieval Europe, where, avenging a slight by killing someone was actually an honorable and moral thing to do. We've now changed that, and we've changed it very gradually through this process where, on the whole, people who are nice to each other have got ahead rather than not. And we are constantly calibrating our behavior against what we see going on in society around us to make sure that we're not overstepping the mark in some way. And yes, we get away with nasty behavior in some subsections of society, but a lot less than we used to. And murder rates are down, and violent behavior is down, and all that sort of thing.
So a few points. Number one, earlier you mentioned, we should be reading the actual writings of those whom we're trying to target. Now that exactly speaks to the fact that many of the people that hold the view that there is no way to explain morality other than through some divine creator have missed the 13 trillion scientific explorations of the evolutionary bases of morality, right? And so I will sometimes troll in a somewhat facetious way some of these folks, many of whom are friends of mine, where I say, yeah, you're right. There is no evolutionary explanation of morality other than, and I just start listing study after study after study after study. And it is literally the case that they haven't bothered reading 30, 40 years of incredibly sophisticated work in comparative psychology, right? Other species exhibit morality. In developmental psychology, the moral instinct manifests itself ontogenetically prior to us having the capacity to be socialized to be moral. Cross-cultural human universals and moral sentiments, and on and on and on. All of these things that perfectly offer a very plausible evolutionary explanation for morality, they miss, and they simply say, well, we have no alternative explanation other than divine. That's exactly what you said, which is they actually haven't bothered to read any of that stuff.
Yes, I quite agree. I do find that very striking. That's a sort of version of what have the Romans ever done for us. What you do to them is to come back. And by the way, the Life of Brian does have memes that seem to just keep popping back up in
all that would be now illegal because it would all be politically incorrect. Correct? You couldn't do Life of Brian today.
Well, I think that's true, and that's ridiculous. It feels to me that mocking religion is an incredibly hard one, right, that from Voltaire to John Cleese has been one in Western society, and we are at risk of losing it. We're reinventing the crime of blasphemy, right, which is the one thing that shouldn't be a crime, in my view. I'm all for not, attacking someone because of the color of their skin, but mocking someone's religious views, in my view, is not a crime. It can be rude, it can be inconsiderate, but there's no way that it's something the state should be outlawing.
Oh, no kidding. The other point I want to mention when you were discussing about the evolution of morality is you said, something that was considered virtuous in the Middle Ages, let's go outside and resolve this with a duel, and, whoever wins has, protected his honor. We don't longer do. Do you feel that now the fulcrum has swung towards too much, tolerance, too much? So in other words, there's going to have to be some autocorrection, sort of the Popperian paradox of intolerance. Being infinitely tolerant to those who are infinitely intolerant it doesn't take much of a game theorist to understand that that's not really an optimal strategy in the long run. What are your views on that?
That's a very interesting question. It's not one I've thought very deeply about, though. So I don't think I have a glib answer to it, as it were. On the one hand, I do see the arrow of evolution of tolerance and dislike of violence and things like that to be going to be a one-way street. I mean, I had this conversation with Steve Pinker some years ago, and I said to him, look, if you can come up with a bunch of things that were considered quite normal in the 19th century, but are now beyond the pale, like, I think fox tossing was a sport, or something, and now nobody would let you do that. What are we doing today that we will look back on in 100 years' time and say, good God, I can't believe they still thought that was all right to do in the year 2019? And his answer was immediate. He said, eating meat.
Oh, right.
He said, keeping animals just for food and killing them just for food is something that, he said, don't get me wrong, I like eating meat, and I'm sure you do too, but it looks like history is heading in the direction where we will eventually say, come on, this is unacceptable.
So do you it's interesting that you say this, because I've had Peter Singer on the show,
yes,
who, of course, is a big animal rights activist. And I asked him the following question. I mean, I set myself up knowing full well what he'd answer. I'm someone who is unbelievably affected by animal cruelty. I mean, I can't imagine a greater evil, even possibly greater than child abuse, because at least a child will grow up to have a voice. Really? I mean, I'm being maybe hyperbolic, but my point is that a child will eventually develop a voice, whereas the animal will definitely suffer in silence. I mean, literally so. But then I said, but that being said, despite the fact that I can't tolerate meat, I do know that when I eat meat, I am participating in, in the cruelty of animal farming. So what do you think? Do you think that I'm being hypocritical? And his answer was yes. But of course, I think that is a bit of a implausible answer, in that surely we need to be able to channel people's moral sentiments regarding animal cruelty away from just binary thinking. You're either a vegan or you're a Nazi, right? So, for example, maybe with lab meat comes, if it evolves into something that is plausible, then maybe that's how I will be able to resolve my inconsistency, if you like. But surely you don't think that humans, who I think we probably both agree there's a tremendous amount of evidence that we have evolved to be omnivores, we're not going to suddenly become vegans as a solution to this problem, correct?
I think it's very difficult to see that happening in the short run. I mean, apart from anything else, fish and meat is too delicious. And veganism is on the rise. There's an awful lot more of it about it. Young women in particular are taking it up, but it's still a relatively rare phenomenon. and people are resorting more and more to environmentalist arguments rather than humanitarian arguments, I think, to advance the cause of that. So I suspect that one will change relatively slowly.
Right.
But you say animal cruelty is one of the things that really disturbs you, etc. To some extent, there's a degree to which we've got a compassion reservoir in us. And if there aren't any wars going on, we worry about donkeys being maltreated in seaside resorts or something, or in Pakistan or somewhere. Yeah. so I suspect there's an element of that. We will seek for things. Human beings will always seek for things to disapprove of and campaign against. And actually, we've got rid of most. We got rid of slavery. Mostly got rid of slavery. We've mostly got rid of, child labor. We've mostly got rid of paedophilia in recent years. And by the way, one of in Evolution of Everything, I have a section where I explore the way in which child abuse and paedophilia went from being something that was frowned upon, but on the whole, you didn't make too much fuss about it in my childhood. To the point where it's now, the biggest crime anyone can think of. Everybody knew certain schoolmasters, you want to avoid him sort of thing when I was young. And you would hear stories, right, well, he's been moved on to another school or priests or whatever. And remember, I was born in the 1950s just. At that time, homosexuality was illegal.
Right.
But paedophilia was not condoned, but it was kind of not that big a deal. Today, it's completely the reverse. And in my view, rightly so.
Sure.
I think we should disapprove of paedophilia, and I think we should be extremely tolerant of homosexuality. I'm just interested in how that changed. Why did one evolve in a direction of more tolerance and one evolve in the direction of less tolerance? Both of them are being more compassionate, I think.
Do you think, I'm surprised that when you said that, pedophilia was not so frowned upon. So let's push on that. Is it because, or let's drill down on that. Is it because many of the sources of pedophilia when you were growing up would have come from institutions that we're not allowed to criticize? Because I can't imagine ever that the human instinct would have said, oh, sure, taking advantage of little children sexually, well, come on, that's not a big deal. So could that be the reason why it was somehow protected?
Yes, I think so. I think it's about respect for institutions, right. Teachers and priests and so on, who were above criticism to some extent.
Yeah.
And sure, it was surely never okay.
Right.
Although there were one or two campaigns in the 1970s when sexual liberation was, increasing everywhere. One or two people included paedophilia as things they wanted to legalize. Now, I think they were fringe people who wanted that.
Right.
I don't think they were.
This is the man-boy love associations and so on, right?
Yes,
love.
Like
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think the only group, or if you like, ecosystem today that is tolerant of pedophilia are the Hollywood elites, where if you have someone like Roman Polanski raping and sodomizing a 12 or 13-year-old girl, well, that's okay because, he's an artistic genius. So they will grant you affordances for, truly the most reprehensible behaviors as long as you somehow fit within their political tribe. I think that's probably the only group that officially can get away with not condemning pedophilia.
I think that is a case of extraordinary hypocrisy that you're quite right to point out.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. So now I want to get to, we've got about 25 minutes left, some of the writings that you've undertaken that I guess have gotten you the most attention, some of which deal with science, others that are political. Let's start with one that is at the intersection of science and politics, climate change. Before I cede the floor to you, let me tell you my little knowledge of it. I'm someone who does exhibit epistemic humility, meaning that if I know something really well, I walk with all the swagger of someone who knows it well. And when I don't know something well, I'm the first to concede and say, I just don't know enough about this issue. I'd like to explore it. So when it comes to climate change, I certainly have not read the literature. But my instinct, and I think it mimics your position, is that yes, there probably is some climate change. Some of it might be man-made. But the greater argument is how much economic expenditure are we going to produce to try to intervene in reversing some of these things. Take it away. Tell us if that's a good summary of your position, and so on.
Well, you might say that what am I doing expressing an opinion on climate change at all, because I'm a biologist and not a climate scientist, and people do sometimes throw that at me. Well, I'm also a science journalist. I've been one for 35 years or so. I first wrote about climate change as a science journalist 30 years ago in the 1980s, and I was quite prepared to take it on trust at that point that this was a very serious threat in the 21st century. I gradually came to change my view on that, but I also, would defend my right to get involved in this, because we are all being asked to indulge in extremely expensive and, in some cases, quite damaging to human welfare activities, like denying coal-fired power stations to Africans who haven't got access to electricity, on the grounds that this is a dangerous problem. And therefore, it is not something that can be left to climate scientists. The rest of us are perfectly within our rights to say we want to understand this and express an opinion on it. It was only when I came to write The Rational Optimist, published in 2010, that I really dug down into this in a lot more detail. And the reason I was doing so was because one of my arguments was that we're nearly always too pessimistic about the environment. When I was growing up in the 1970s, the population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, pesticides were going to cause us to shorten our lives, the desert was advancing, the rainforest was decreasing, the ozone layer was collapsing, my sperm counts were falling. All these, one after another, these scare stories came along, acid rain, whatever it is, culminating, of course, in Y2K, when the whole civilization was going to collapse because of the millennium bug. So the current one in the early 2000s is climate change. That global warming is the latest and biggest of these threats. And the fact that the others were mostly exaggerated led me to my first supposition, which was there's a chance that people are exaggerating this one too. But I don't stand on that as my only argument, obviously. I then go into the science of it as deeply as I can, look at the same scientific studies that everybody's looking at, and I come to the conclusion that the evidence for the positive feedbacks that you need to produce really dangerous climate change are not there. In other words, carbon dioxide alone can't produce dangerous warming. You need a trebling of the effect through basically water vapor and clouds in the atmosphere. And the evidence for that is very flimsy. The evidence for carbon dioxide as a warming factor is very strong, very good. The evidence for the feedbacks that amplify and exaggerate the effect is nothing like as good. And the way this is panned out is that estimates of climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide have come down over recent years because of these positive feedbacks being better explored. So the threat itself is being exaggerated. In other words, we can increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere without dangerous climate change for a longer period, if you like, although eventually we may reach a warming where there are tipping points, etc., etc. The second point is that the measures we are taking to combat it are proving more expensive and more ineffective than we hoped that they might. So when it was the case that the ozone layer was being damaged by chlorofluorocarbons, we said, let's ban these chemicals and find alternatives. Now, we still don't really know that was what was causing the ozone layer to be damaged. It almost certainly was, but it's not certain. But we were acting with precaution, and the action turned out to be relatively cheap, as did the action to remove sulfur from power stations burning coal to address the acid rain problem. So where the precaution is relatively cheap, it doesn't matter if the problem is exaggerated a bit. Now, in this case, it turns out that trying to get humanity off an 87% dependence on fossil fuels for its energy without damaging human welfare is going to be very, very difficult. We keep saying we're going to use renewable energy, but wind and solar now produce less than 2% of world energy after an enormous expenditure on them. We're closing down nuclear power stations because we find we can't run them cheaply because of all the environmental safeguards we've demanded, etc. So actually, the 87% dependence on fossil fuels has barely changed in 20 years. It may be 85, 86, I don't know, but it's it's in that order. So we this isn't it's turning out to be a very difficult problem to solve. And it's probably not as bad a problem as we thought. Now, you can throw back at me all sorts of things. What about this? What about sea level rise? What about etc.? And I can throw back at you studies showing that yes, they're problems, but no, they're not as bad as some people are saying. And the problem is that an enormous amount of what we get told has now become activist science. Scientivists is the phrase sometimes used, that people are not really behaving objectively, but are competing with each other for media attention by making scary claims about climate that are based on pretty ridiculous assumptions. So let me give you an example. There's an economic model of what might happen to emissions in the 21st century called RCP 8.5. It's the hottest scenario. It's the one that produces the most warming. And almost whenever you see a study in the media saying temperatures could rise or sea level could rise by some large number, it's because they've used RCP 8.5 as their assumption, as their assumed economic scenario. And you say, well, okay, that's just because it's the biggest. Well, let's look at RCP 8.5. It assumes that population growth will re-accelerate after slowing down for the last 50 years. It assumes that we will burn 10 times as much coal in 2100 as we burn today, that by then we will be 50% dependent on coal instead of 28% dependent on coal for the energy supply of the world. I mean, this is bonkers.
So the assumptions of the model are incorrect, therefore garbage in, garbage out. That's your point.
Exactly.
Right.
Sorry, too long an answer. But it is, of course, a gigantic question, and I can't answer every, I can't deal with everything that everyone brings up. But I call myself a lukewarmer. I have yet to see evidence that it is as big a problem as some people say, and that the measures we are taking are going to help. We're taking chemotherapy for a cold. We're doing expensive and damaging things for something that isn't that big a problem. And there are much bigger environmental problems out there. There's rainforest destruction. There's overfishing of the oceans. There's invasive species causing extinctions on islands. There's all sorts of things that it would be nice to have as much emphasis put on.
Well, look, life and certainly economics is about trade-offs, right? And so yes, it's nice to reduce some, onerous metric from X to X minus delta. But if in the service of reducing it from X to X minus delta, I have to bankrupt the universe and I have to spend trillions of dollars, then the question becomes, for that delta reduction, was it worthwhile? So I think that's really what's missing from that conversation. Yeah. We all agree that we should live in a nicer, greener Earth, but at what cost? But I guess my other question, and then we'll move on.
By the way, we do live on a greener Earth. I mean, one of the things that I keep writing about, because I think it's very interesting, is this evidence from the satellites that actually we've seen a 14% greening of the planet over the last 33 years.
Oh, that's a nice
as a result of the extra CO2 in the atmosphere, because it enables plants to grow faster. It's not just the satellites that's showing this. The amplitude of the CO2 variation in the northern hemisphere shows this. There's more green vegetation every summer and more decrease every autumn. So actually, and this is particularly in semi-arid areas, because plants struggle, they lose water when they're getting CO2 into their leaves. So if there's more CO2 in the air, they actually do better in dry areas. So a lot of places like the Sahel are a lot greener than they used to be 30 years ago. So actually there are upsides of CO2 in the air.
Well, there you go. One sort of, I don't know if you have the answer to this, but one quick question, and then we'll move on to another topic. Why do you think so? I mean, so the climate change alarmist, what do you think is driving them? So partly it could be that because, there is actually an evolved tendency for us to pay attention more to negative information rather than its equivalently valence positive information, right? That's called the negative bias, actually. And so that speaks to your optimism, pessimism issue. So in part, if I constantly scream, we're all going to die, that draws attention. So that's one. But that's one possibility. And a second possibility might be that they don't look at these trade-offs. So they only look at the reducing the delta without looking at the cost of reducing the delta. A third might be that it's a form of orgiastic virtue signaling to a quasi-religion that's now become, climate change is my new, is the altar at which I pray. Do you think that it is a combination of all of these factors that is causing these alarmists to succumb to such hysteria? Is that it?
Yes, I do. I think it's a combination of all of those to some extent. And I'd like to describe those in ways that aren't pejorative.
I'm from the Middle East, so pejorative is okay. I'm not as diplomatic as a British lord.
Okay.
Regain your composure and go on.
There's a very nice study by Daniel Gilbert came out last year called Prevalence, Induced Concept Change, which is about how if something gets rarer, we redefine things to
right.
keep them in the category. And to some extent, our sort of instinctive pessimism is explained by this, I think, that, we're running out of things to complain about, so we've got to complain about something. Why climate change has had such a hold on so many people for so long. Of course, politically, it hasn't got the hold that a lot of its activists would like it to have. To some extent, it's got its own institutions, it's got its own bureaucratic momentum now. It's got these ridiculous meetings that go on for 12 days and cost a vast fortune, where everybody argues and then comes to no conclusion at the end. And everybody calls themselves a delegate to a conference of the parties and all this kind of thing. So there's an element of bureaucratic inertia going on there. But look at the politics of this. Donald Trump says he's a climate skeptic, okay, even more than me. He thinks it's a hoax. I don't think it's a hoax. I just think it's exaggerated. Why does he say that? Is it because he stays up late at night reading papers about climate sensitivity and going through the equations? I don't think so. It's because to get the Republican nomination, he had to say that, okay? And 4 or 5 years before he was president, he was signing letters to the New York Times saying, we must take action on climate change. It's there. There's a full-page advert with his signature at the bottom. So for politicians, and did Hillary Clinton raise it in the 2016 election and say, why aren't you being... No, she never brought it up. Why? Because she knew it wasn't a vote winner. So actually, politically, it's already a bit of a busted flush. And a lot of the environmental movement knows there's climate fatigue out there with donors and is looking at other issues, hence the salience of the plastic issue, which has its exaggerated problems too, but is basically, I'm quite happy worrying about plastics more than we did before, because it is an issue. I think we should be incinerating it, in my view, so it doesn't get transported around the world for so-called recycling, which ends up being dumped in the ocean. But there we are. So I think a bit like eugenics a century ago, climate change will fade with a whimper rather than die with a bang, if you like, but it will become less important. People will tiptoe away from it politically, unless we get dramatic warming in the next 10 or 20 years. At the moment, we've had 3 years of cooling since the El Nino, so temperatures are back to they're pretty reasonable. There's not that much has changed in most places of the world.
Well, one of the things that upsets me about the climate change folks is, so if you take, for example, fatalism or destiny, it's obviously not a scientific theory because there's no way to falsify it. If I step out of my house and I'm hit by a truck, that was my destiny. If I step out of my house and I don't get hit by a truck, that was my destiny. Therefore, all roads lead to my destiny. There's no way to falsify that. Well, the same thing happens, in my view, with climate change, right? If tomorrow there is cooling, aha, climate change. If there's warming, aha, climate change. If it's parabolic, aha, climate change. If it's inverted U, so all possible effects are a demonstration of climate change. If it doesn't warm, it's a manifestation of a onerous form of warming. So there's no way to falsify it, correct?
Yes, that really does annoy me, because a lot of the media is very happy to use weather events as evidence for climate change. We had a very hot summer in 2018 in the UK, and everybody was saying, "See climate change, see climate change." And I pointed out that I'd written an article back in 2009-10 and 2010-11 when we had two very cold winters in the UK with a huge amount of snow, much more than we pretty well record amounts of snow and record low temperatures. And I said, I actually wrote an article in the newspaper in that winter saying, this is not evidence of global cooling. A cold winter is not evidence of global cooling. Right. So next time there's a hot summer, will you please not say that that is enough to prove global warming? But I was ignored, and they did. One of the side effects of taking the view that the position that I have on climate change is that it has done far more damage to my reputation than any other issue. I mean,
because you're a science denier, you're a hick, you must be a Republican.
Exactly. That gets thrown at me all the time. I meet people who say, look, I used to like your work, but I just can't take it now because you're a climate change denier.
Well, I think there is the next topic I'm going to talk about that also damaged your reputation, but go on.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Did you finish your point?
But you get the point. If I was trying to stay in an institution like a university or even a newspaper full time, I'm a self-employed writer, so I don't have to worry about what my employer thinks. I would have to moderate my view on this, and that feels wrong.
No kidding.
That feels religious, and that really irritates me. Why can't I say what I think?
Do you still have? We've passed the 1 hour. Can we still do another 10 minutes? Do you still have enough time for that?
Yeah, I have to go to the cinema very soon.
I know.
But 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, let's do that. Let's try to wrap up. So the topic that I tease the audience with is your position on Brexit, which, by the way, I support. So you don't have to worry. You're amongst friends here, but all of the smarter people, not simpletons like us, not mentally challenged idiots like us, who know better, know that only right-wing, nativist, and pick the rest of the buzzwords, idiots would support Brexit, including our mutual friend. I mean, he's more of your friend than mine, although he does follow me on Twitter, the great Richard Dawkins, who, in my view, completely went wild with the Brexit issue. So tell us your position about Brexit, and why do you think so much of our highfalutin intellectual colleague friends disagree with us?
Well, I wasn't necessarily for Brexit when we were first talking about it, when we first talked about having a referendum. Remember, the Prime Minister said, David Cameron, that he would go and ask for reforms of the European Union because it was an institution that was increasingly centralized and bureaucratic and not delivering for the people of Europe. And the euro had been a disaster, and it's setting its face against innovation in all sorts of ways. Could we please have some meaningful reform and not try and do everything in a centralized top-down way, trying to create a federal state run from Brussels, but have a much more a European Union in which countries negotiated with each other to keep open trade and all that kind of thing. And he came back with nothing. They offered him no reforms at all. And at that point I said, well, in that case, I don't want to be in this institution anymore. I will campaign to leave it. And my main reason was because of the EU's attitude to innovation, if you like. Take genetically modified crops. The European Union is missing out on fantastic opportunities to improve not just the productivity of farming, but the benefits to the environment too. and it takes an incredibly negative attitude to this absolutely wonderful technology that just today is come up with a new piece of science, which is the photosynthetic efficiency work that's been done in Illinois. So that's just one example, if you like, of where the system of passing laws based on lobbying in Brussels,
right, by unelected officials.
By unelected officials. And the only way that a directive or a regulation can start in Brussels is from the Commission, which is unelected, not from the Parliament. 60% of our rules were coming into our country that way. We weren't able in Parliament, where I sit, to influence or alter them. The European Union was heading towards trying to be much more like a top-down nation state, if you like, an empire.
Right.
And as for the idea that this is nativist or anti-immigration or something, well, there are a lot of people in this country who have faced competition for both benefits and jobs at the bottom end of society from immigrants from Eastern Europe and other parts of Europe. And we have created more jobs than the rest of Europe put together in the UK in the last 10 years. So we have been in a very important safety valve for Europe, and we've sent an awful lot of money to them to help with this. But our immigration policy at the moment inside the European Union is, in a sense, a bit racist. It's based on complete free movement for any random Bulgarian who is probably white, but very, very tough for an Indian who is related to someone who's already here but can't get a visa to come here. Now, so that's why an awful lot of Asian Britons actually voted for Leave. And actually, if you go through the Conservative Party MPs, most of the ones of Asian origin voted to leave. Right. So it's not a racist phenomenon. I have no idea whether I'm right that we should leave. Of course, I might be proved wrong. But remember, we were told that if we voted to leave, both the Bank of England and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the finance minister, said we would see 500,000 unemployed and an immediate and profound recession.
There's the alarmism again, right?
Exactly. And the opposite has happened. We've increased employment by about 250,000 in that period. So the Project Fear that we were given in 2016 has proved to be wrong. And I think Britain would be better off. It's the most external-facing country in the European Union. It does more of its trade outside the European Union than inside. 90% of global growth is going to come from outside the European Union. If we're inside it, we have to have this high external tariff, which discriminates against producers in Africa and other parts of the world who are much more deserving and with whom we can trade much better. And it believes in harmonizing regulation so that everything is the same in every country rather than mutual recognition, where we would say, we've got food safety regulations, you've got food safety regulations, they're both good enough. If it's good enough for you, it's good enough for us. That's the kind of relationship we have with the United States or with China or Japan. It should be the kind of relationship we should have with our European partners. So I do think that we have to get out and make a success of it and be very, very good friends with the countries and people of Europe. They are our neighbors, but we are a global trading country, and we want to be part of the world.
A quick rebuttal, and then I'll ask you to promote anything that you'd like to promote, and we'll wrap it up. I think what bugs me the most about both the Brexit issue and, say, the Donald Trump matter amongst our intellectual colleagues is that people whom I otherwise would certainly attribute great sophistication and intelligence and nuance can demonstrate the same type of hysteria, in my view, that you would otherwise attribute to those who are less intellectual and sophisticated, right? So many people that I know who are truly brilliant minds absolutely lost it when Donald Trump was elected, right? I mean, would there still be Earth? Would it be a nuclear holocaust? Would we still be allowed to have sex? Would there be food shortages? Would the zombies be coming out into the street? Now, these are the same people who in other contexts, you listen to them and you go, wow, what a brilliant mind, was the same person who was succumbing to that hysteria, which speaks to something that I discuss in my forthcoming book, which is we all have the capacity to be parasitized by hysteria and bad ideas. The fact that you're educated, the fact that you're smart, doesn't somehow inoculate you from some of these cognitive and emotional biases.
Well, Philip Tetlock, I think, has shown that experts are sometimes worse
exactly.
than
That's
ordinary
exactly right.
people.
Exactly. All right. I know you have to head off to the cinema. May I ask which movie you're seeing?
It's Mary Poppins, the new version.
Very nice. So, are there any projects that you are currently working on that people don't know about yet that you might want to use this forum to promote?
Well, it's quite a long way off, but I'm halfway through writing a book, and it'll come out in 2020. It's going to be called, I think it's going to be called, How Innovation Works. And I don't yet know the answer.
Very nice. Well, it's
what's your book called, Gad?
Right now, it's called The Parasitic Mind, precisely because of these idea pathogens that parasitize us. I'd like to maybe find a title that's a bit more hopeful, that has more prescriptions. I don't want the book to be simply, let me show you all of the idiotic ideas without arming people with the vaccination against the bad ideas. So it might change, but it currently is The Parasitic Mind. Thank you for asking.
How to vaccinate your mind.
That sounds like a pretty good one. Thank you. And if I use it, maybe I'll give a shout out. Or maybe you write a little blurb for it. What a pleasure. I've been a fan of your work for a very long time. What a pleasure and honor to meet you. Please work on that knighthood with the Queen. Don't forget. I'm counting on you. And I hope we can resume this at some point in the future for round 2 of our conversation.
Really nice to talk to you, Gad. And thanks for the invitation.
Hi, everyone. I hope that you've enjoyed my chat with Matt Ridley. As you can surmise, it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort to put these together. I have to contact the guests. We have to organize when we're going to be chatting. I have to prepare for the interview in some cases, or chat rather. I don't like to use interview. These are chats more than interviews. Actually hold the chat, then upload it and so on. For a typical conversation, this might take between 3 to 6 hours worth of work. I hope that you can agree that time is not free. It takes me away from other activities that I could otherwise pursue. I do this simply for the love of adding to the pantheon of ideas. So if you enjoy these conversations and would like to support my work, you can do so. I'm still on Patreon. If you don't wish, although I took a huge hit, I'm now down roughly 1/3 of the money that I was receiving from all of my generous donors from about a year and a half ago. So I've really taken a huge hit. You can also support my work through PayPal. There used to be Subscribestar, but now they're offline for a while, so you can't use them. You can go to the SAAD TRUTH online store. All of these icons are available on my homepage on my YouTube channel. So you can buy mugs, stickers, t-shirts, sweatshirts, and so there are many ways that you could support the channel. I hope that you'll agree that if you are consuming this material, it's always nice to provide some reciprocity. So I'm counting on fan support to continue these chats so they could remain free and available to everyone that wishes to have their minds expanded. Hope your year is off to a good start, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much. You can, of course, also subscribe if you haven't done so. You can press the bell icon to make sure that you are alerted whenever I post something, and you can post comments. So any way that you could support the channel would be greatly appreciated. Cheers, everybody. Thank you for your interest. Cheers.